In April 2025, Donald Trump stood in the Rose Garden of the White House and declared economic independence. He called it Liberation Day. He announced sweeping tariffs on imports from dozens of countries, but the real target was China. Within days, the effective tariff rate on Chinese goods entering the United States had climbed to 145%. 145%. China responded immediately. It raised its own tariffs on American goods to 125%. American farmers lost their Chinese export markets overnight. American manufacturers discovered that the components they needed had suddenly doubled in price. Consumers walked into stores and found empty shelves where cheap electronics used to sit. And here's the part that should make everyone stop and think. This was not the beginning of the trade war between America and China. It was the moment a conflict that had been building for 50 years finally burst into the open. Because the real story of how America and China became rivals is not a story about tariffs. It is a story about the most consequential economic decision in modern history. A decision made in Washington in 2001, and how it went catastrophically wrong. This is that story. To understand where we are, you need to go back to 1972. Richard Nixon flew to Beijing and shook hands with Mao Zedong. It was one of the most dramatic diplomatic reversals in the history of American foreign policy. For 23 years, the United States had refused to officially recognize Communist China. Then, in the space of a single week, it all changed. The logic was cold and strategic. The Soviet Union was the main enemy. China and the Soviet Union had fallen out. Therefore, an opening to China weakened the Soviets. Simple arithmetic. What nobody in Washington was thinking about in 1972 was what China might become 50 years later. Through the 1980s, American companies began investing in China cautiously. The labor was cheap. The regulations were minimal. The potential market of 1 billion consumers was intoxicating. By the 1990s, American corporations were moving manufacturing to China at a pace that was transforming both economies simultaneously. China was getting richer. American factory towns were getting hollower. But the political consensus in Washington held that this was fine, that free trade was universally beneficial, that a richer China would become a more democratic China, that economic integration would produce political convergence. Every one of those assumptions turned out to be wrong. The decision that locked in the relationship, and that American politicians now call the biggest strategic mistake in a generation, came in December 2001. China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. It was presented at the time as a triumph of globalization. China would now play by the rules of the international trading system. Its markets would open. Its government subsidies would shrink. Its currency manipulation would end. None of that happened. What did happen is that American companies accelerated their manufacturing shift to China at a scale that had never been seen before. Between 2001 and 2018, the United States lost approximately 3.5 million manufacturing jobs. 3.5 million. Entire industries, furniture, textiles, electronics, steel, hollowed out. The communities built around those industries hollowed out too. The political rage that built in those communities over the following 2 decades eventually produced Donald Trump, not as a cause, as a symptom. Meanwhile, China used its WTO membership not to liberalize but to industrialize. State subsidies, currency controls, forced technology transfers from foreign companies operating inside China. A relentless national strategy of moving up the manufacturing value chain, from cheap toys to smartphones to electric vehicles to artificial intelligence infrastructure. By 2024, China had become the dominant manufacturer of electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and the rare earth minerals that all of those technologies depend on. America had built its rival with its own money. Here is the detail that keeps defense planners in Washington awake at night. Rare earth elements. 17 metallic elements with names most people have never heard are essential to virtually every advanced technology in the modern world. Electric vehicle motors, wind turbine generators, smartphone screens, precision-guided missiles, radar systems, jet fighter engines. China controls approximately 60% of global rare earth mining and around 90% of global rare earth processing. 90%. This is not an accident. China identified the strategic importance of rare earths decades ago and systematically built dominance over the supply chain while the rest of the world was not paying attention. In October 2024, as tensions with the United States escalated, China began restricting exports of heavy rare earths and rare earth magnets. The effect on American defense contractors and technology manufacturers was immediate. Components that had been reliably available for years suddenly became scarce. Prices spiked, production timelines stretched, and the uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. The United States military's ability to build the weapons it depends on is partially dependent on materials that its primary strategic rival controls. That is the rare earth trap, and there is no quick way out of it. When Trump's Liberation Day tariffs hit in April 2025, the immediate effect was chaotic in both directions. American consumers absorbed higher prices on everything from electronics to clothing to car components. American farmers lost Chinese export contracts they had spent decades building. The U.S. trade deficit with China, which the tariffs were supposed to eliminate, narrowed. But the deficit with Vietnam, Mexico, and Taiwan exploded as supply chains simply rerouted through third countries to avoid the tariffs. Companies did not stop buying Chinese-made goods. They just started buying them with extra steps in between. China's response was more strategically sophisticated than simply matching tariff for tariff. Beijing reduced its own tariffs on imports from the rest of the world, locking in relationships with Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, while American trade policy was making the United States an unreliable partner. By early 2026, China had become the largest trading partner of more than 150 nations. America had the more powerful military. China had the more connected economy. That gap is widening, not closing, and in a conflict being fought through supply chains and technology standards rather than armies, economic connectivity is the strategic weapon that matters most. The tariff war reached its peak absurdity in the spring of 2025 when effective tariff rates between the world's two largest economies briefly exceeded 100% in both directions. At that point, it was not really a trade relationship anymore. It was two economies that had spent 50 years becoming deeply intertwined, suddenly trying to pull apart. And discovering that the threads were everywhere. American hospitals found that certain medical supplies were only made in China. American defense manufacturers found that circuit board components were only available from Chinese suppliers. American consumers found that the alternatives to Chinese-made goods either did not exist at domestic scale or cost 3 times as much. The supply chain the United States had spent 50 years building in China could not be dismantled in 50 months. Or 500 months. The Supreme Court struck down some of Trump's emergency tariff powers in February 2026, reducing the most extreme rates. A fragile stabilization set in at the leadership level. Trump and Xi met multiple times. But the underlying competition for semiconductor dominance, for rare earth supply chains, for AI infrastructure, for the trade relationships of the developing world, that competition did not pause for diplomatic meetings. It accelerated through them. What does history tell us about economic conflicts between rival superpowers? The honest answer is, they rarely end cleanly. The British and Dutch fought 3 naval wars in the 17th century over trade dominance. Britain eventually won. The Dutch did not disappear. They adapted, specialized, and remained prosperous. But they were never again the world's dominant trading power. Britain and America had their own economic rivalry in the late 19th century. American industrial output overtook British output in the 1890s-70s. By 1945, the dollar had replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain did not collapse, but it was never again what it had been. The pattern history suggests is not that one side wins and the other disappears. The pattern is that a long grinding competition produces a new equilibrium. A world organized differently than the one that came before, with different centers of gravity, different supply chains, different alliances. That reorganization is happening right now. U.S. imports from China have returned to near 2001 levels the year China joined the WTO. 25 years of economic integration, partially unwound in 3. Vietnam, Mexico, and India are absorbing manufacturing that used to sit in China. A new map of global production is being drawn in real time. And here is the question that every fallen empire in the series has eventually had to answer. When the world reorganizes around new centers of power, Which side ends up at the center? The answer, historically, goes to the side that controls the critical inputs, the energy, the minerals, the technology standards, the trade relationships with the nations that are still growing. Right now, on most of those metrics, China is ahead. That does not mean the story is over. Every empire in this series looked dominant before the cracks appeared. The question is whether America sees the cracks in time to respond. History suggests the ones that do not look fall. This is The Fallen Empires. Subscribe for weekly history, war, and geopolitics. We will see you next week.